The wedding feast should have been a moment of joy, a celebration of new beginnings under the wide-open skies of the frontier. The ranch house was alive with music and laughter, lanterns glowing against the dusk as neighbors raised their glasses and spoke of blessings. Yet, beneath the warmth of clinking cups and fiddles playing in the corner, a storm was already gathering. The bride's mother sat silent at the table's end, her gaze fixed not on her daughter, but on the man she had just married, her lips pressed tight as though holding back a truth too heavy to bear. The husband, proud and steady, felt the weight of that stare more than any words spoken. He had survived droughts, gunmen, and the unforgiving trials of the West, but the cold judgment of family was a wound no revolver could defend against. Every laugh that echoed through the hall sounded hollow to him. Every toast a shadow of the disapproval he knew simmered at the edge of the room. For the first time in his life, the land beneath his boots felt unsteady. When the mother rose, the hall fell silent. Her voice was calm, but her words were sharper than a blade. She spoke not of blessing, but of curse, declaring before God and kin that the man her daughter had chosen carried a secret darker than any outlaw's past. Gasps filled the air, forks froze halfway to mouths, and the bride's smile vanished like a flame in the wind. What should have been a feast of union became a gathering of judgment. The husband stood, his face carved from stone, but his hands betrayed the tremor of a man whose life was unraveling in front of friends and enemies alike. He had fought battles under the desert sun, had risked his life for land and honor. But this was a battle waged not with bullets but with words, and it struck deeper than any wound of flesh. The curse hung in the air, heavy as smoke, impossible to ignore. The family that had once seemed unshakable now teetered on the edge of ruin. The bride's eyes filled with questions, her heart torn between love and blood. Guests whispered in disbelief, the weight of scandal spreading faster than prairie fire. And in that single moment, beneath the lantern light of what should have been the happiest night of their lives, the truth began to claw its way out of silence, threatening to split the family apart forever. The hall trembled with silence after the curse was spoken. Men who moments earlier had raised their cups in laughter now sat frozen, their eyes darting between the mother and the groom. The air thickened with unease, the lanterns flickering as if the truth itself had dimmed the room. The bride clutched her hands together beneath the table, her knuckles white, her heart beating louder than the fiddler bow that now lay silent against the strings. She had dreamed of this day since girlhood, yet now she stood on the brink of ruin before the ink on her vows had dried. The groom's jaw tightened as he faced the weight of the accusation. He had endured the desert sun that split the earth and the nights, so cold they froze a man's bones. But this wound came from within the very family he had sworn to join. His honor, his name, his place in the community, all balanced on the knife edge of the mother-in-law's words. And in the West, a man's name was worth more than gold or cattle. It was the very ground upon which his legacy stood. The mother's eyes blazed with fury masked as sorrow. Her voice did not tremble, though the hall quivered at her declaration. "This man hides a past that will bring ruin to my daughter," she declared, her words deliberate, as if each one were a bullet fired into the foundation of the marriage. She spoke not as a grieving mother, but as a judge and executioner, her curse laying bare the fracture in what should have been unity. Guests leaned closer, whispers filling the silence. Had he killed a man? Had he stolen land? Or betrayed blood? The West was full of stories where men's sins followed them like shadows, and everyone knew that no one truly outran the ghosts buried in the desert. The weight of possibility pressed heavier than fact, for even before the secret was revealed, the curse had already planted its poison. The bride turned her gaze on her husband, searching his face for denial, for a plea, for any truth she could cling to. But he stood silent, his eyes fixed on the wooden floor, his chest rising and falling like a man standing before a firing squad. His silence was louder than any confession, and in that moment, she realized that the curse might not have been born of spite, but of knowledge. The tension spread through the feast like wildfire on dry grass. Men cleared their throats nervously, women exchanged uneasy glances, and the fiddler tucked away his bow, unwilling to play a note until the shadow hanging over the hall was lifted. Even the children, sensing the shift, clung to their mother's skirts in silence. No one dared rise from their seat, for the air itself felt chained by the weight of revelation. The groom finally raised his head, his eyes steady but hollow. He met the gaze of his new bride, her face pale as moonlight, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Is it true?" The question pierced him deeper than any bullet. For in the West, battles could be fought and wounds endured, but a woman's trust, once broken, could never be restored by force of will. He drew breath to answer, but the mother's voice thundered again before he could speak. "You all know the land he claims," she said, pointing a sharp finger toward him. "But what you don't know is how he came to hold it. That soil is not his by right. It was bought with betrayal, watered with blood. He wears the mask of an honest man, but his fortune is a grave dug for another." Her words cut deeper than the sharpest spade, tearing at the roots of his very identity. The guests gasped, their whispers swelling louder, weaving tales from fragments of rumor. In the Old West, reputations spread like dust storms. Once loosed, they swallowed everything in their path. Some looked at the groom with suspicion, others with pity, but all with the certainty that this night would be remembered not for its vows, but for its curse. The bride trembled, torn between loyalty and dread. Her fingers brushed against her wedding band, the gold now heavy with doubt. She had given her vows before God and man, but in that moment, she wondered if she had married not a partner, but a stranger. Her mother's curse had sown its seed, and she feared the harvest would be ruin. The hall, once alive with the rhythm of boots and fiddle strings, had grown as still as a graveyard. The groom's silence gnawed at the hearts of those watching, for in the West, when a man did not deny, suspicion often became truth. His bride's eyes shone with tears, her breath shallow as she searched his face for a single word of reassurance. But he only clenched his fists tighter at his sides, as though holding back an admission that threatened to break loose. The mother's voice struck again, steady as a preacher's sermon. "He speaks nothing because he cannot deny it. I warned my daughter, but she would not listen. Now all of you will hear what I kept hidden for too long." Her words carried the conviction of a verdict already written, and the guests leaned forward, their curiosity as sharp as hunger. The groom lifted his gaze then, but it was not anger that burned in his eyes. It was the exhaustion of a man cornered by truth and haunted by memory. Whispers crackled across the room like brush fire. Men exchanged knowing glances, recalling long-forgotten rumors of boundary disputes, of bloodshed on land that was never rightfully his. Women murmured prayers under their breath, clutching at rosaries or shawls, as if protection from the truth could be found in cloth or beads. The hall had ceased to be a place of celebration. It had become a tribunal where reputation was weighed heavier than vows. The bride, trembling, stood at last. Her voice quivered, but it cut through the noise. "Tell me it isn't true," she begged, her hand reaching toward him as though love alone could shield her from betrayal. Her words held no accusation, only desperate hope. But in the groom's silence, her hope crumbled, replaced by a fear as cold as the desert night. The ranch hands at the back of the hall shifted uncomfortably, their hats clutched tight in their hands. They knew that in the Old West, secrets buried in the soil never stayed hidden for long. The curse was not in the mother's words. It was in the truth clawing its way up from the earth, demanding to be heard. At last, the groom's voice broke the silence. Rough and gravelly, it carried the weight of confession more than defense. "I did not steal the land," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "But it was not mine by right either. It came to me through blood, through choices made when the night was darker than any of you can imagine." The room stiffened, for his words did not cleanse suspicion. They deepened it, drawing everyone closer to the edge of revelation. The bride's breath hitched, tears spilling freely now. "What choices?" she pressed, her voice trembling but resolute. She was no longer the girl who had dreamed of love. She was a woman demanding truth, even if it shattered her world. Her mother's face hardened, as though victory had been carved into her expression, but behind her eyes, there lingered not triumph, but something colder, vengeance. The groom raised his head then, meeting the gaze of the crowd with eyes hollow from years of carrying silence. "A man died for that land," he said plainly. Gasps erupted, chairs scraped against wooden floors, and a prayer or two was whispered under trembling breaths. In that instant, the curse was no longer just words. It was flesh, blood, and a grave hidden beneath the soil they all walked upon. The bride stumbled backward, her hands clasped against her chest, as if to steady a heart that threatened to break apart. Her veil slipped from her hair, tumbling into the dust, forgotten like the dreams of innocence she had carried into the feast. Guests rose from their seats, some in shock, others in condemnation, all consumed by the weight of the confession. The mother-in-law stood tall, her curse now revealed as prophecy. She had not invented lies to break the union. She had unleashed a truth too heavy for silence to contain. And as the night pressed on, it became clear the feast would not end in dance and laughter, but in ruin and the echo of a secret that had split one family forever. The groom's words struck like a hammer against the silence. A man died for that land. The hall erupted in gasps, chairs scraping, women clutching at their throats. The truth was no longer rumor. It was blood. The guests shifted uneasily, torn between pity and condemnation. The Old West had seen countless feuds over fences, rivers, and herds, but this was not a fight between strangers. This was a family curse, laid bare beneath the glow of lanterns meant for celebration. The bride staggered, her tears streaming unchecked. "Whose life?" she whispered, her voice trembling so softly that only those nearest heard. But the question rippled through the crowd, growing louder in every whisper that followed until it filled the hall. The groom closed his eyes, his face shadowed with the weight of memory, unwilling to speak, but unable to silence the truth now clawing at the open air. The mother stood taller, her voice rising with fierce conviction. "His silence tells you everything," she declared. "You feast in his house, you drink his wine, yet the soil beneath your boots is watered with blood. My daughter was blind, but I will not let her bind her life to a man whose name is cursed." Her words carried the finality of judgment, and for a moment, the entire room bowed beneath them. The groom finally lifted his head, his eyes hollow but steady. "It was not murder," he said slowly, each word heavy as iron. "It was a fight born of pride, of land that men thought was worth more than blood. But blood was spilled nonetheless, and I have carried it every day since, not as a thief, but as a man who cannot outrun what was done." His confession rolled through the hall like thunder, breaking apart whatever fragments of joy the night still held. The bride pressed her hands to her chest, her heart torn in two. She had sworn to stand by him, but now she wondered if her vows had been spoken to a man or to a grave that walked in his shadow. Around her, the guests murmured, their eyes filled with pity and fear, for they knew that in the West, a man's sins never stayed buried. Sooner or later, they returned to claim everything he loved. The room seemed to lean in closer, every soul hungry for the name that hung unspoken. At last, the groom's voice dropped to a low growl. "It was my own kin," he admitted. "A cousin, a man who thought the land was his by right. We fought under the moonlight, words turning to fists, fists to steel. When the dust cleared, only one of us still breathed. And that land, this land, was left to me, but never by peace." His words shattered what little hope remained for the night to recover. The bride fell to her knees, her sobs filling the silence that followed. Her wedding dress, once white as snow, now seemed draped in shadow. Her friends rushed to her side, but she waved them away, her eyes fixed on her husband with a mixture of love and horror. She had wanted truth, and now that she had it, it tore her heart like a blade. The mother's lips curved into a bitter line, her curse fulfilled. She had warned them all, and now her voice carried the triumph of vindication. "I told you," she said coldly. "The desert remembers blood, and it stains every hand that touches it." Her words rang like a prophecy, echoing against the wooden beams of the hall. For her, this was no longer about protecting her daughter. It was about punishing the man she had never trusted. The guests shifted uneasily, their joy forgotten, their faith in the marriage destroyed. Some muttered that the sheriff ought to be called, that blood crimes should not go unanswered, even years later. Others argued that the fight had been fair, that men of the West often settled disputes with iron and fire. But all agreed on one thing. The wedding feast had become a courtroom, and the sentence had already been spoken. The groom stood motionless, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his confession. He had fought gunmen, droughts, and storms, but nothing had ever left him as defenseless as the truth now standing naked before all who mattered. He looked at his bride, his voice breaking. "I wanted to spare you this. I thought love could bury it. But nothing stays buried in this land." His words carried sorrow deeper than shame, and in them, the crowd heard not only guilt but the echo of a man resigned to lose everything. The sheriff, seated quietly at the far end of the hall, finally rose to his feet. His spurs clinked against the floor, each step commanding silence. The guests turned, their whispers dying as his shadow stretched across the room. He removed his hat, his weathered face carved with lines that spoke of countless nights spent weighing justice against mercy. "Blood spilled on land is not forgotten," he said, his voice low but steady. "But it is not for curses to decide guilt. It is for the truth to speak, and for men to carry the weight of it." The mother scoffed, her eyes flashing. "Truth? His truth has already cursed us. My daughter is bound to a man who carries death in his shadow. Do you call that justice?" Her voice cracked with fury, but beneath it was something more complicated, a pain sharpened by years of distrust, a wound that had never healed. She stood not only as a mother protecting her child, but as a woman who had lost her own faith in redemption. The groom's hands trembled, but he did not lower his gaze. He had faced outlaws on horseback, their rifles trained on him, but this moment cut deeper than any bullet. He turned to the sheriff, his voice quiet but unyielding. "I never denied the blood," he said. "I buried him with my own hands. But I swore I'd use that land to build something worth the loss, something that would honor his memory instead of shame it." His words rang with sincerity, but sincerity alone could not wash the stain of blood. The bride clutched her veil, torn and dust-streaked from the floor. Her tears had dried, leaving her eyes hollow and red. She looked between her husband and her mother, torn in two by love and loyalty. She had grown up hearing that the desert tested every soul, but she had never imagined her test would come like this, on the very night meant to bind her to a future. Now she wondered if her vows had tied her to love or to ruin. The hall quivered under the tension. Friends and neighbors leaned in close, whispering judgments they would carry long after the lanterns dimmed. Some pitied the groom, seeing a man cursed by fate and honesty. Others condemned him, saying no good could come from blood-soaked land. But all agreed that the wedding had ended not with vows, but with a reckoning that would stain the family forever. The bride's father, who had remained silent until then, rose slowly from his seat. His face was pale, his eyes clouded by the storm unfolding before him. He placed his hand gently on his wife's arm, though she stiffened at his touch. "Enough," he said, his voice heavy, tired. "The truth is a fire, and once lit, it spares no one. If we keep feeding it, it will burn this family to ash." His words quieted the murmurs, though the damage was already done. The mother pulled away, her voice sharp. "Better ashes than chains. I will not watch my daughter live under a curse. This land, this marriage, it will destroy her." Her rage filled the hall, but behind it was fear, deep and raw, the kind only a mother could feel when watching her child step into danger she could not shield her from. The bride's knees buckled, and she sank into a chair, her body trembling from the weight of the night. The groom moved toward her, but she raised her hand, stopping him in his tracks. "I need the truth, not protection," she whispered. Her words carved a canyon between them. Love still lingered, but it was buried under a mountain of doubt. The sheriff looked between them, his expression unreadable. "The law can't erase what's been done," he said, "but it can keep the land from turning into another grave." His words carried both warning and promise, though no one in the hall knew which would come true. The land itself seemed to breathe in the silence, as if it too demanded justice. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows, carrying dust through the cracks of the old boards. It was as if the desert itself had come to listen, bearing witness to a family torn apart. And though the music had stopped and the laughter had died, the night was far from over. The secret had only begun to splinter what once seemed unbreakable. The bride rose again, her veil slipping from her lap onto the floorboards. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady, trembling only with the weight of truth. You both speak of curses and blood, but none of you ask what I choose. This is my life, my marriage, my burden to carry. The hall hushed, every eye fixed on her, for in that moment, she was no longer a daughter under her mother's shadow, nor a bride beneath her husband's silence. She was a woman standing in the storm. The groom looked at her, his chest heavy with both fear and hope. He wanted to reach for her hand, to plead for forgiveness, but the strength in her eyes stopped him. She had asked not for protection, but for truth, and he had given it. Whether she could love him beyond it was a choice only she could make. His heart pounded like hooves across the prairie, waiting for her verdict. The mother's fury faltered for the first time. Her lips parted, but no words came. She saw her daughter's fire, the same fire she once carried as a young bride herself. Memories flickered, dreams buried by hardship, love soured by betrayal. She wanted to protect her child, but she realized no curse, no warning, no outcry could shield a woman from the choices she made with her own heart. The sheriff shifted his weight, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, not as a threat, but as a reminder of order. The West don't hand out happy endings, he said quietly. It hands out truth, and truth either binds or it breaks. His words echoed like scripture, spoken not only to the bride and groom, but to the entire hall. The bride inhaled deeply, her hands clenched at her sides. If this land is cursed, then I will walk its soil. If his name is stained, then I will share it. Love does not erase the past, but neither does fear. Her words struck the crowd silent, their weight greater than any curse her mother could speak. For in her declaration, she had chosen, not blindly, not naively, but with the resolve of a heart that would not be commanded. The groom bowed his head, his breath unsteady as relief and sorrow tangled within him. He had expected abandonment, condemnation, perhaps even exile. Instead, she had chosen him in the full light of his shame. It was not forgiveness he felt, but something harder, acceptance. And in that acceptance, he found a strength greater than any gun he had ever drawn. The mother collapsed in her chair, her hands covering her face. The fire of her anger gave way to tears, bitter and hot. She had fought to keep her daughter safe, but safety was an illusion the West rarely allowed. She wept not only for the curse she believed had fallen upon them, but for the realization that her daughter had grown beyond her protection. The father placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, steady and firm. She has chosen, he said gently, and choice is the only freedom the West gives us. We cannot steal it, not even as parents. His words carried the weary wisdom of a man who had seen too many graves dug for lives spent chasing control. The sheriff tipped his hat and stepped toward the door. Then let be done, he said. The law will watch, the land will remember, but the rest is theirs to carry. His spurs rang against the wooden boards as he left, the sound marking the close of the trial that had never been meant for a courtroom. The hall remained quiet, the feast ruined, the laughter gone. But in the silence, something unshakable had been forged. The curse had not vanished, the blood had not been forgotten, but a choice had been made, and in the Old West, that was the only truth that ever mattered. The bride and groom stood side by side, their future uncertain, their love scarred, but their bond unbroken before the eyes of all who had witnessed the storm. The feast that had begun with music and promise ended in silence heavy as stone. The curse spoken by the mother had torn open a wound buried deep beneath the soil, forcing truth into the light where it could no longer be denied. Yet in that silence, a choice was made, not by the parents, not by the neighbors, but by the bride herself. In a land where pride often outweighs mercy and blood stains every decision, her voice rose as the only beacon strong enough to guide the night. The Old West was a place where secrets traveled faster than horses and reputations lingered longer than footprints in the dust. What happened in that hall would be whispered in saloons, told around fires, and carried into the canyons as both warning and legend. A man's past, a mother's curse, and a woman's choice, woven together into a tale that reminded all who heard it that love cannot escape history, but it can stand in defiance of it. The groom's confession did not cleanse him, nor did it condemn him completely. It marked him as human, flawed, burdened, and willing to carry the shadow of his past rather than hide from it. And the bride's decision to stand with him was more than devotion. It was a declaration that strength is not the absence of scars, but the courage to live with them in full view of the world. Their union was no longer about vows spoken at the altar, but about the choice to face a cursed truth together. The mother's tears showed the hidden truth of every parent's heart. Love does not always protect. Sometimes it breaks. Her curse, born of fear and fury, did not destroy her daughter. It revealed her. And in that revelation, the mother faced her own lesson, that no curse holds greater power than the choices freely made by those we love. The land may carry blood, but only the living decide how to walk upon it. If this story struck you, let its echoes stay alive. Share your thoughts in the comments. Was the bride's choice a mark of strength or a folly? Subscribe to the channel to journey with us into more stories where truth and legend collide under the western sky. And leave your like to ensure these voices keep riding forward. Because in the end, the Old West teaches us one thing above all. Every tale becomes immortal when someone chooses to remember it.